There we go. And here are our Chicago sponsors. You see here on your screen, we do have a couple of supporting sponsors for today's event. A few more, so thank you to all of them. And we have 3 showcase sponsors for today. We will have 2 of them present right now very briefly, and then we'll also have one come up in the middle just to kind of give us a little bit of a break. So if we want to go ahead and do that now, I was going to ask if Barry Porter you're welcome to go ahead and try to share your screen, Barry.
Very good. Let me just do that. Is that showing?
Yes, it is.
Wonderful. I'll rattle through this because we want to get to the main event, and we've got 3 sponsors today. First of all, just thanks to CNG for allowing us to continue their sponsorship of this. We always enjoy getting involved in these sessions. We do a lot of community stuff within the Surpass community, so we see a lot of crossover in terms of the style and the type of conversation which we have in the CNG. Just going through quickly. If anyone doesn't know who we are, we're essentially an assessment platform, end-to-end assessment platform. We see a lot of item banking and authoring in the US, along with task management. But generally, a lot of them are exporting out to third-party providers as well. But we are end-to-end assessment platform. This is what we do. This is our sort of reach, if you like. We deliver pretty much all around the world. Lots of exams being delivered through Surpass into test centres. Lots of candidates taking tests at any one time in the platform. But we're talking about accessibility today, which I'm looking forward to hearing more about from the panelists. But just to tell you a bit about what we do, our mission is to improve the assessment experience for everyone, and we mean everyone. So what we want to make sure is any candidate that's taken a test is not disadvantaged in any shape or form in terms of how they take that test. It should be, if you've got visual impairment or hearing impairment, you should be able to take that test. So we strive to make improvements in the product to make the platform more accessible to everyone. So really, our mission, which has been the same since 1985, is to improve the assessment experience for everyone. Just a few things which we do. I mean, this is pretty standard. Color preferences. We move to like a HTML format, which means that we have greater control, or candidates have greater control in terms of the delivery style, so they can just change the look and the contrast. I'm just picking out a couple of the features which are coming up in the platform. Excuse the example, but you'll get the premise behind it. But this one is about assistive media. So the whole point being is that you can assign assistive media to different MCQ item types. So if you've got a question which is, I mean, the example which we've got within Scotland, and I think it's in Wales, that if you've got children and you're wanting to sort of assess the phonics that they're using, then you could incorporate that sort of thing into an MCQ response. So an example here, which one was Clint Eastwood? And then you've got sound bites that goes with each of those answer options. The other thing was, this is coming up in our next release, which is coming out in December, and this is for screen readers. This will support screen readers. So I don't do a lot of accessibility testing myself, but I was experiencing firsthand, the use of Mac OS sort of screen reader and JAWS, and there's a lot of stuff that comes out at you. But one of the things which we've done is this skip link, which basically allows you to skip the candidate who's using the screen reader to skip directly into the content. So they're moving out of the navigation on the left-hand side and moving straight into the content side of things, which just reduces a lot of that noise, the audio noise associated with getting into the actual content. And there were some other features about the sort of flow of tabbing within the content, which we're improving, tooltips and improvements to the voice, the screen reader support that we have in there, which is coming in the next couple of releases as well. In all of that, I just want to let you know that there is a Surpass community which is available to anyone to join. It's not just about people that are using Surpass. We're very interested in just talking to the industry. So if anybody's interested in just signing up, listening, contributing, There's a link there, surpass.com/community. There's loads of webinars. It's all free. You can just access it as you want to. And there's a follow link on there as well. And if you've got any questions about anything that we do at Surpass, then you can just reach out to me. Email and number is there. And that is all I've got to say, because I want to move on quickly to the next sponsor.
Thank you, Barry. Yeah, so we'll take one more sponsor, and then Luke, we'll get to you a little bit towards the middle of the program. So Sheil, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. If you want to go ahead and give us a few minutes of your time, please.
Thanks, Pam. And as Barry said, I'll keep this brief. I don't want to do death by PowerPoint. This is just a few slides. So let's do this. So hi, everyone. My name is Ashil Parmentier. I'm Director of Account Management for Lineup. For those of you who don't know Lineup, Lineup is a volunteer management system that centers around subject matter experts and putting together your workshops and panel. I do want to thank CNG and the Board of Directors and Programming Committee for putting together our meeting today. It's always fun to participate in these. So I do want to talk about a little bit, given the content, about our journey through accessibility. And I do emphasize the word journey because it's continuing and ongoing. It's something that we started this year. And off the top, I do want to say that one of the founding principles of Lineup is diversity. We were actually founded by a nonprofit that was seeking to get more diversity in its exam maintenance program. And so we are built on a foundation of trying to make Lineup accessible for everyone and removing barriers for people using our platform is a core value of what we're doing. We want you to all expand your SME pool and make it more vibrant and diverse. So earlier this year, we actually set up on this journey and we partnered with an organization called ABLE. So ABLER's worked with us to understand some of the shortfalls in our platform and in our website. So they've done a series of automated tests and manual tests. So they took 2 weeks and they run a series of these automated tests, and then they actually follow up with disabled people going through our website and our platform and seeking out some of the things that they're not able to do in our platform. And so one of the first things that we did in this process with ABLER is actually create an accessibility statement. And this is just stating from the top that Lineup is committed to ensuring that its website and platform are accessible to everyone. And we give people with accessibility a place to reach out to us if we're falling short in certain places. So we go through this process with ABLER and we're given this report. And given that we hadn't actually optimized our website or our platform for accessibility, we were actually pleasantly surprised with how we performed. We did better than we expected, to be totally honest, but that is to say that there's a lot of work to be done within Lineup to make it more accessible. And that's something that we're actually literally currently in the process of doing. You can see our top 3 issues are contrast, info and relationships, and name, role, and value. And so what I found out over throughout this process is this is incredibly technical and complex things. So what these are saying is some of our contrasts aren't quite up to par. We're using some redundant graphics that might not be able to be read by screen readers. And some of our forms are inconsistent that struggles with screen readers as well. So those are some of the things that we're working on now to work on fixing that. And so we've got an entire plan to work through with ABLER it is a 3-month plan. But of course, it goes well beyond that. Every feature that we roll out, we have to work through and make sure that it is accessible for everyone to use and optimize that Lineup is usable for everyone. But we're in the middle of that remediation plan. We're starting with the easy to fix issues, and then we're working on to the higher priority issues. And then we're actually getting all of that validated by ABLER, which is going to be happening here in the next month or so. And then we're going to seek to get our WCAG certification, and that is a Web Content Accessibility Guideline certification. And we'll seek to maintain that as Lineup goes forward. And one of the things I'll finish up with is if you're seeking to start this process for your program or for your software, I would I would find an impartial third party, because it's really hard to do these things when you're so close to it. Really take the time to work through with these consultants and find one that you have a great relationship with, because you're going to work really hand in hand with these people to try and make your website better. If anyone has any questions on this, feel free to hit me up in the chat or email me, and I appreciate everyone's time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to very briefly go back into my very short presentation that we have, because we want to get into the good content. So let me find that screen. So again, thank you. And in a little bit, we will have a quick demonstration or a quick chat from Luke. So he'll remind me a little bit in. So we'll kind of get a brain break here. So again, as you know, here's the topic that we are discussing today. And I'm really excited because I think that a lot of our participants today are not our typical participation, or it's not our typical group, because we're pulling in people from all parts of the exam and training parts of, our different industries. So we have our two presenters today. I won't get into it, but Sam Evans is a certification manager for the International Association of Accessibility Professionals, and Tasha Patterson, our Chief Operating Officer for the Disability Management Employer Coalition. And I will let them share a bit more about themselves. And so let me stop sharing there. And yeah, so this program, Sam and Tasha, if you'd like to, and everybody else is welcome to come off video as well, but this program came about where, accessibility and diversity, inclusion, all that stuff, it came about because, the conversations are happening, but we need to continue to make it a really big part of that conversation as we are working from soup to nuts when we're beginning that process of developing or re-engaging for our trainings, for our exams and so on. So I'm going to let, we don't have a PowerPoint for today. This is just going to be a very open dialogue. Sam and Tasha are going to give us some background about themselves, but also a little bit more about the industry and where we've gone, where we are, and where we need to go. So Sam and Tasha, do you want to, Sam, since alphabetically, would you like to introduce yourself a little bit more and why you're in this field?
Sure. So my name is Sam Evans, and I am a white woman with long silver gray hair. I've got my purple glasses. I'm talking to you from my home office. There's some bookshelves with some tchotchkes behind me. But I work in the accessibility profession. So as you know, the friends from Lineup were just talking about their accessibility roadmap with ABLR 360. I've been involved in disability rights and social justice for about 30 years, so for a long time. And so now I work with a membership organization that is all accessibility professionals. So all of our members are people that work to remove barriers for people with disabilities in the digital space, physical space, and also with policy and governance. So my role in certification is I build, manage, and maintain all of our certification programs and our credentials that are granted to accessibility professionals. So it's a nice overlap for me. And it was really exciting to see somebody working with ABLR 360, which is a great group out of North Carolina. And that's the ideal pathway and discovery journey. So I'm excited to be here.
Thank you, Sam. Tasha, a little bit more about yourself.
Hey, everyone. I'm Tasha Patterson. I love that Sam did a little bit of a description of herself. We're seeing that more and more. So I also am wearing glasses. I've got brown hair, and I'm joining you guys from Colorado. I did go to college in the Chicago area, so I'm familiar with the winters in Chicago and feel very thankful that I'm in Colorado. My journey, I have been in the association world for most of my career, primarily in the marketing and operations departments. I currently am the Chief Operating Officer of the Disability Management Employer Coalition. We go by DMEC for short, to keep things a little bit more manageable in terms of pronouncing our name. But we really are focused on education, training, networking for absence and disability management professionals in companies across the United States and Canada. So it's a pretty niche group of people. They typically sit within like an HR or risk or safety section of the company, and they deal specifically with accommodations for disabilities in the workforce. So allowing people to participate in the workforce with reasonable accommodations, as well as leaves of absence. So if you think about the Family and Medical Leave Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, both of those are compliance components that our members deal with on a regular basis, which has really led us on our accessibility journey. We obviously are supporting these individuals with education, and we wanted to ensure that our education and training programs that we were rolling out were accessible and that they served the community that we provide that education and resources for. So that's kind of where we got started in terms of the accessibility journey.
Thanks to you both. So that's, Tasha's obviously more on the training side of things, and Sam obviously is on the examination and delivery side. So who would like to, of either of you two, Tasha, actually, why don't you start if you could? You were talking about ADA and FMLA and stuff, and can you just share a little bit more with, because we don't know who has what familiarity with these types of things. So if you can kind of give that background that you shared before, and then Sam, if you have anything to add about where we've been and the history behind a lot of these new advancements.
Sure, absolutely. So the FMLA is really around job protected leave for employees to deal with their own serious health condition, the serious health condition of a family member. So if you think about, individuals who have to go out for surgery or cancer treatments, or they're having a new baby, or the FMLA is really designed to have job protected leave for those instances. As we've seen across the last couple of years, a lot of state leave programs have popped up. There's a federal program that's still in play in terms of a paid program, but the FMLA is 12 weeks. There's some additional leave that can be taken to care for military members. But that's really focused around leave of absence from the organization. The ADA is really around ensuring that individuals with disabilities have equal access to all points of employment. And that's really where we are focused. So what we typically focus on primarily is that reasonable accommodation process. So walking with somebody through what might they need in order to perform the essential job function. So whether that's maybe a screen reader, or they need an interpreter, or it could be something as simple as ergonomic equipment in their workspaces. That really is an interactive one-on-one process with each employee to determine what they need to do those essential functions of the job. And part of that, what we've seen is that accessibility at the digital space. And I'm sure Sam can speak quite a bit to this, but there's not specific guidelines in the ADA around exactly what accessibility looks like within websites. Obviously, we have the WCAG guidelines that were referenced a little bit earlier, which help provide a guideline for us. But we have seen a lot of lawsuits and cases that lead us to understand what they're looking for in terms of ADA and accessibility with websites.
Thank you. Sam, you want to talk a little bit more about exams and so on, that history? Oh, where'd you go, Sam? Did a fur friend? Look, I saw him. We'll give it another minute. Sam, where'd you go? Maybe she's still here. She's not here. Okay, so while we wait for Sam to come back on, Tasha, can you talk about some of the ways you had mentioned a little bit about like workplace accommodations and so on, but can you also talk about how you go about, what are some simple tasks that you have found through your members or through your specific organization policies and so on that have changed over the last little bit or the last 5-10 years, or things that you are consistently working on to help with that accommodation? And just simple things. Let's just start with that, because there's things that a lot of our organizations may be doing. We just do them because we've always done them, but ways that we can potentially start to challenge those.
Absolutely. I think that somebody mentioned earlier that it's a journey, and I would definitely echo that. There are a lot of components to accessibility, and as you kind of start the journey and uncover what needs to be done, I think it can feel a little bit daunting to start that process. I definitely think there's a lot of great resources out there, and I recommend that as kind of a first step of just getting an understanding about what accessibility means, what some of those guidelines are that have been provided through WCAG, and what that might mean for your organization. And I do, recommend partnering with groups that do this as a third-party service. They have a lot of resources, not only technical digital resources, but then they also have resources with disabled individuals who can then test things on your site, which is really nice. But some of the simple things that we have looked at is, we provide closed captioning for all of our webinars, all of our videos, all of our training. We also provide transcripts, so providing simple options in terms of how people are viewing those. Color contrast is a really big piece, ensuring that there's enough contrast that people with low visibility can see that. We also have looked at tabbing. A lot of us use mouses to navigate through things, and ensuring that the accessibility is there in terms of, tabbing through content. That gets a little bit more technical as you're using multiple platforms, but it's definitely something that, is a simple fix that I think has, a big impact in terms of accessibility. And then we've also done things as simple as, our exam is a timed exam when people complete their certification, and we have an option for an untimed exam. And we've made that available if people request that accommodation from us. And that was something that we could do within our structure and requirements, is allow that piece to be untimed. And that was something that was simple that we could offer to our members who are going through our certification program.
And thank you for that, Tasha. That's a really good segue. And Sam, we can talk about that in a little bit as well. But one thing that has kind of resonated with me as we've had these discussions, and as I'm continuing to learn more about why it makes business sense to be inclusive and have accessibility policies and procedures, is, you need to ask yourself, and I'm not an accessibility expert by any means, but it just keeps sitting in the back of my mind, is Tasha gave the example of a timed exam. Why do we have a timed exam? Is it because a board 20, 30, 40 years ago, when the exam started, they said, well, someone has to be able to complete this in 2.5 hours. Why? If someone has unlimited amount of time, what things change because you remove that time barrier? And Sam, we'll backtrack here in a little bit, but did you want to talk a little bit about that? Because I think that's kind of a passionate topic that you like to discuss. Do you want to talk about why removing some of these barriers helps and makes sense?
Yeah, so this is Sam Evans, and sorry, I lost my power, so I disappeared for a moment. I'm back on batteries. We work with a lot of disability community and advocacy groups around the world, and I think that there's a concept that the way you prove proficiency, and this is conceptual, and probably psychometricians could speak to the proper terms, but there's a concept that the way you illustrate your knowledge is that you can do it quickly under pressure, and you can just draw upon your experiential knowledge, and you can complete that in a timed test zone. But what we do know about humans is that there is stress even if you do not live with a disability, there's a stress of a time zone of performing in a set number of minutes, or, you know, how many questions you have to answer. If you add into that anybody that has reading, learning disabilities, cognitive disabilities, anxiety, any other elements that happen in the human experience, we start building barriers into their success. And so we allow people additional time or time and a half on our exams. Our certifications are also timed as well. But I'm looking, and we're still trying to find proof that a human that actually needs additional time is going to do better. Or even if somebody doesn't have a disability and thinks they want additional time, the likelihood of them performing better on each exam item hasn't been illustrated. Because what tends to happen in the human brain is that people, if they don't know the answer, they're going to second guess themselves. And the guesstimates that happen after that of 25% possibility of getting it correct to, oh, I'm not so sure, let me eliminate one or two. Now it's a 50% chance. What we seem to have found is that there's not really any proven data. And if there is, I'd love to read it, that's fine. But I don't think people do better when they're given extra time. I think they second guess themselves. But if we're trying to find if the reasonable accommodation in the workplace would be additional time due to a brain injury or a concussion or a migraine, if we're going to grant those accommodations in the workplace as reasonable, there's not a good standing valid data from disability rights perspective to not allow that in the testing dynamic.
And that kind of goes back to what I was hoping we could have you speak to a little bit about with your background. And I love what you and I had talked about before. Let's just talk about disabilities in general, because as we've talked about, and it's not, you know, necessarily a new concept, but someone doesn't necessarily have to have a clinical diagnosis to have a disability. So can you speak to that and why? I don't want to give away your whole speech, but you have a great opener. So I'd love for you to share that with the group.
Sure. So, and as Tasha was talking about what ADA provides and allows for, and in the US, so we'll speak to US regulations and standards here. The ADA, you do not have to have a doctor's note on stationery with a clinical diagnosis to qualify to be able to make a request for an accommodation. A lot of things that provide the opportunity for accommodations to do better are situational or temporary and are not permanent. So the likelihood of somebody going to a doctor, an occupational physical therapist, or a speech therapist to get paid $850 to get a diagnosis on a piece of letterhead that says you have migraines occasionally and you know, may need to turn the lights off, have additional time, is not likely. But we also have a challenge with a lot of adults who do not have formal diagnosis, but know what works best for them. And so there are some challenges that with some of the practices that are in place, both in the workplace and in credentialing, of requesting proof that you are disabled enough to qualify for an accommodation is a bit of a challenge. So, but under ADA, by the letter of the law, you don't have to have a written diagnosis on letterhead from a doctor or a specialist to qualify to make a request. All that's really required is that something in your life prevents you or brings additional challenges to perform activities of daily life.
Yeah.
So now formally in the workplace, HR managers may request proof of in order to, if they have to encumber funds or procedures or cost to provide accommodations, and they can request that. But it can be as simple as, I've received accommodations before. Hey, my manager and I've talked about this and I need these things, or I can't lift that or do this. And those are not the sorts of things, those are accommodations that can be granted, but we have to understand that the human experience, especially when we talk about mental health, cognitive, intellectual disabilities, things that are situational or temporary, are not the things that people go and spend diagnosis on an assessment for, but they still place people into a position to have a need for accommodations, most of which are reasonable, most of which don't have costs associated with them, to be able to provide the optimum human experience so that people can succeed.
So a lot of things, you know, I'm assuming that the majority of the organizations that we're all representing today are probably more in the business of testing and scoring adults.
Yeah.
So can we have a conversation about, Sam, on that concept of improving the human experience? And one of the things that went through my mind when we first started talking was, well, it's going to cost me a whole bunch more money to get rid of the time limit and to just, hold that seat at the proctor, the testing center, or with the virtual proctor and so on. So can we just talk a little bit more about that? And just because, again, that was the first thing that came to my mind, because I'm not an accessibility professional, that, I'm going to have to justify this to my stakeholders and my board and my committee. So can we talk about that and how there's ways that we can accommodate this without, again, just touching on that human experience?
So we know, so we're talking about budget planning strategy, the numbers, the bottom line. I know with my test partner that each additional hour is an additional $10 or $20, depending on the format they're in. So I know that some of my test takers are going to be 2-hour test takers, and some of them are going to be 4-hour test takers. I put in my budget and my mix. My strategy is that I'm going to be inclusive for planning. I have in my budget and my strategy that I'm going to include sign language interpreters, private rooms. So I have that in my budget because I know it's going to happen. I know that is part of the human experience. And when I'm engaging with several thousand people around the world every year for certification exams, I'm going to have at least 25% of those people are going to make a request for an accommodation, because we know statistically 25 to 27% of the adult population in the workforce has a disability that's diagnosed in the US, in Canada, in the UK. We know this. This is a given. So if we are actually talking about inclusion and DEI, that should be part of our strategy when we talk about finances, budgets, and resources.
Tasha, did you have anything to add to that, and why it makes financial sense to be accommodating?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo what Sam says. We budget as well for accommodations, for conferences, for training, for certification, as just part of our budget. And you may use more or less of that during the year, but it's much better to plan for that at the beginning than at the end. And I think, from our perspective, we've seen a lot of employers go through this process and have, EEOC investigating issues in terms of accommodation. So we always go back to, it's much easier to be proactive and provide the accommodation than what might come if you have some sort of issue with accommodations or lawsuits or whatnot, because it's going to be much less expensive on the planning side than on the lawsuit side. So from our perspective, it just makes more sense financially to plan for that. And have good processes in terms of asking about accommodation. So that's part of when somebody's registering for something, that's built into the registration process. And that way staff can reach out and find out what is that accommodation, what's needed for that individual. It's really making that part of the process in terms of the initial registration or sign up for any of the exams or certifications or training.
Tasha, that's a really good point. And going back to I have written down here, some of the easy tasks, the easy buttons that we can initiate right off the bat. What are some ways that you and Sam have implemented changes that don't affect the integrity of the exam, that don't get into items necessarily, or the accessibility side of it, but what are the accessibility of the exam items or the training and so on? What are some ways the second that a candidate or a potential learner gets in touch with your group, what are some ways, and I'm specifically talking registration, what are, because we're all just, well, we have to collect this information and it's really important that we do this. So can you speak to that a little bit, and how and why things should be addressed differently? Like Tasha, to your point, like on the registration form, you need accommodations or something, but Sam, I think also what we've talked about is, and this gets a little bit into the diversity, equity, and inclusion side of it. I'll just throw out a simple example. Why are you asking for their prefix? So that's a pretty abrupt shift, but I do want to talk about it because we want to get the notion out there that our programs are inviting and inclusive to everyone. So I'll let either of you speak to that.
So this is Sam, and I'll speak to just going back to from a data geek perspective. Don't ask for data you're not going to use or do something with. If it's just for formality for how you want to address somebody by postal mail or by email, if you're going to ask somebody for their prefix, if you're going to make it a populated list, you need to make all of the possible prefixes or titles available or allow people to provide or to opt out. So gender diversity, identity, and orientation can all, that's not about disabilities per se, but those kinds of diversity considerations, we tend to blueprint and copy paste things that have always been done. That doesn't bode well for progress towards current day knowledge. So tradition may hold for some things, but it's kind of the death knell for organizations that are moving towards more inclusion and belonging. So if you're going to ask for data, you have to do something with it. So unless you are tracking gender identity and orientation about your candidate pool, and you're going to display that data in an anonymized, aggregated format, if you don't need it, don't ask for it. And allow people to opt out.
Have all the options.
Yeah, or have all the options, but a lot of people don't know what the options should be. And so that's a little bit about how much education have we provided to our own teams and selves to know what we should be doing. And so that, you know, there's the implication that a woman must have MS or MRS is a bit dated.
Yeah, and to your point, Sam, what are you really going to do with that information, knowing the men performed this differently from the women or the males versus the females? So that if it's just information that, oh, that's great that this is that statistic, but it doesn't affect the candidate necessarily. So just, yeah. Tasha, did you have anything to add to that?
And I would just add that sometimes you need to work with a third party for that as well. You know, some of us own our registration forms and own the process, but a lot of that needs to have discussion with third parties as well. And some of those groups don't necessarily have the same understanding. So you really need to be the champion for your organization in terms of items like this. We found that with our learning management system and with our, association management system, we were really driving the conversation with those groups because it wasn't something that they had on their radar or on their, planning timeframe or roadmap. So you have to advocate for yourself in terms of those third-party partnerships and contracts.
So in a little bit, I do want to get a chance to touch on those third-party vendors and partners that you do deal with. And I know that I'm flip-flopping a little bit, but say, Sam, this is, I think, a little bit more of your expertise in your territory, but say you opt to go for a virtual delivery of an exam, you have a virtual proctor and so on, but you want to make sure that you are including these accessibility features into the candidate's experience. Can you talk about ways that you've seen organization or that your organization has implemented these changes to alert and notify your vendor or the proctors? Because, we all know that especially a virtual proctor, in-person proctor is a very different story, but virtual proctors, they follow a script. And if they see something out of the ordinary, they're going to flag that, and that will have other consequences. So Sam, would you like to talk about that a little bit in your experience and recommendations that you'd have?
So this is an interesting discussion, and there is a certification delivery partner that specializes in high-risk, high-level regulatory exams, and they train their proctors very differently than what remote proctors are trained to watch for. So this is where we'll kind of see ableism on display in our industry, because proctors are taught to watch for what is quote unquote normal behavior. You'll hear things like normal and standard. So what that means then is when there's a variation from what's considered the normal, they are watching for things that might possibly be compromising. So what we do for our online remote proctors, when we know somebody has a person with a disability, we will identify and say, if they want to disclose, but disabled people shouldn't have to disclose things that are normal parts of their everyday lives. But you would have to tell a proctor, this person has a twitch, this person has eyes that do not focus forward only, this person may move, this person may vocalize and speak aloud to think through their thought process, this person may need to move around, this person has a glucose monitor, so they will need to check their monitor, they will need to eat, they will need to drink. So there are a lot of things that I think our online remote proctor world is taught that in the world of disability and the human experience, people would be tagged, flagged, or an exam stopped. So we, knowing that that's a challenge, we do have, if somebody discloses, because we allow on our applications people to tell us if they are requesting additional time or an accommodation for disability. If they choose to volunteer that information with us, we can then let the proctor know specifics for that person. But I happen to have an account manager and I work with a small enough partner team where we can make those kinds of things happen. It's harder on scaled large dynamics, but most of our disabled candidates choose a private remote proctoring where we know what disability means and they're not going to be penalized for it. So there's some challenges given what is expected for online remote proctors to flag. Eyes moving, speaking out loud, movement, looking in different places, vocalizations, movement, food, drink, any kind of electronic equipment, even glasses. You have to take off your glasses. You have to show you have nothing in your ears. So a lot of the dynamics that are set up for security purposes are actually anti-disabled people. There's a conflict that's built into what is labeled online remote proctoring best practices and the disabled experience.
Thank you. So we are about 50 minutes in, and that's kind of the point in adult learning where you probably need to do a quick stretch and a little bit of a brain break. We have a lot of good conversations that are coming in, and there's some other really important things that Sam and Tasha are going to bring back up. So I'm going to set a timer for 5 minutes. I will show it on the screen. Sam and Tasha, is that okay that we'll take 5? So let me share my screen so you can see where I'm at. Where are we? Okay. I thought this was going to be fancier than it was. Okay. Do you see the timer now?
Yes.
Okay. So we'll come back in less than 5 minutes and we'll continue the conversation. So please come back. We got a lot to talk about. And I'm going to place in the chat, if anybody's here still hanging out, we have a pretty informal who's who type thing since we can't exchange electronic business cards. I have a little document. I'll paste it again in case anybody came late. Feel free to include your information. And yeah, because you may have said something in one of your networking rooms and someone didn't catch your name, and don't overwrite anyone's, of course, but please feel free to go to that link. Forgot that I can share music, but I guess we're a little late for that now, because there's a way to broadcast music. Don't tell the recording groups, Recording Artists of America, but Zoom allows it. So, all right, we're getting ready to wrap this up. 2, 1, ding, 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 ding. I don't know if you heard that. That was fun. So anyway, welcome back. I am now going to turn this over to our friend Luke really quick. He's one of our supporting sponsors for today. Luke, do you want to go ahead and share your screen?
You got it. I'll just make sure that we can see this. Can you tell me if you see that, Pam?
I do. It looks great.
Awesome. Thank you. And I'll keep this very brief as well. I don't really want to interrupt the flow of the conversation today because it's been excellent. Just a couple of quick details here. A lot of people have never heard of us or are a little confused on it. So I'll set the record straight there for a minute. But thanks to Pam and the team and CNG and everyone for holding today's meeting. This has been wonderful. Just continuing to see everyone, getting to chat in the breakouts. So thanks for the opportunity to speak today and share a little bit more and setting this up. So who are we? Many people had heard of the organizations within Measure Learning, which is ProctorU. ProctorU created the remote proctoring industry over a decade ago. It's been brought up before, and I think some people have heard of that. And then Yardstick Assessment Strategies was actually formed about 15 years ago as well, and was a leader in the online exam delivery services market as well. And about 2 years ago, the two companies came together and figured out that a marriage would be a good idea to have between the two. And that's where the Measure Learning name came from. We actually partnered together and formed Measure Learning as a parent company. And the focus there was to offer kind of a best in breed option for online proctoring as well as exam delivery. And there we go. What I wanted to highlight for just a second here was really focused on today's discussion at a high level, which has been the approach that our organization has taken to learning and testing, certainly with a focus on online testing and learning. When we think about accommodations and accommodated needs and such, one of the key elements there is comfort. and people being accommodated and comfortable in the way that they are learning, the way they are taking an exam, the way that they're furthering their education and their career. One of the things that's been really important for us, certainly over the last 2 years with COVID, is giving people the ability to do that where traditionally they're most comfortable indeed, which is sitting at their home, maybe at their kitchen table, on their own equipment and computer. You'll notice here, we've referenced some of the technology enablement that we have with proctoring, but one of the core pieces of that is a test taker sitting in front of their own device, one that they're familiar with. It has the programs and the technology that they're used to using every day, and executing their learning and their testing outcomes on devices that make them feel as comfortable as possible. There's obviously valid reasons for in-person testing and things of that nature, but this is really a foundational belief for us when it comes to the aspect of doing accommodated testing for learners and utilizing their own devices. For security and reporting, a couple of elements of that, which again tie back to the way that we administer exams with learners. One is around the quality. So we've talked today about how the requirements are made for someone with an accommodated need to be able to inform a proctor of how that needs to be executed, and then ultimately delivering that exam with a quality outcome. We do that directly with information available to every proctor on any session that has an accommodated need. That also ties into the reporting that's available coming out of those exams as insights to our clients to allow them to really understand testing as a whole that runs through the remote proctoring and exam delivery platform that we provide. And lastly, instant reporting. Once again, the ability to tie in any type of accommodated learning and needs with the outcome and the results from a proctored session is key. And the instant reporting we provide gives a really detailed look of exactly what transpired for the proctored session, and gives that information back to our clients to be able to understand and then make decisions as needed. The business continuity, again, goes back to both accommodations and a global perspective of proctoring and exam delivery. In our breakout session earlier, we were talking about how did everyone figure out how to manage the last 2 years? And at the foundation of it all is really, how are you future looking, forward thinking, and able to build a contingency plan that gives you redundancy in all of your different capabilities. So we've built a network that allows us total exam delivery on demand, and thankfully allowed us to operate over the last 2 years, which again goes back to not just accommodated needs testing, but candidates in general, furthering their careers, their testing, their credentialing, and being able to move that forward. And lastly, I'll wrap up with this. We're just thankful again for the opportunity today to join our partners. We've got some of the strategic partnerships that we've built, some colleagues that are here on this line today. Really, one of the foundational pieces of our business is to continue to bring that best of breed opportunity to our partners. So whether that is directly from the services we provide or the partnerships that we have formed with organizations, as you see on here, on screen here rather, we ultimately deliver that to almost 2,000 different clients around the world. We listed a couple of those here. And again, thankful for the opportunity to bring these different solutions to test takers as a whole, those in a traditional sense, those that need accommodations as well, and give them that opportunity. So I'll pause there, Pam, send it back to you, and we can carry on.
Thank you, Luke. Sam and Tasha, you want to come on back to the front? Sam, let me unmute you. There you go. Thank you, Luke. We do appreciate that. And thank you to our sponsors from earlier in the program. So welcome back. Hope you had a nice stretch break. So since we've had a lot of really good conversation going on in the chat, and I do want to get to that towards the end of the program, but one thing that it might be a good segue into now is, Tasha, this is pretty prevalent in what your practices are, but can you talk about how what things you've initiated with those people that you do business with, your partners and vendors, and why that matters? And then Sam, I'd like you to also talk a little bit about also why that matters and how that's going to help propel us and help propel those people to continue to do business with our organizations and with those vendors.
Absolutely. As we started on the accessibility journey, what we found is that our third parties weren't, as I mentioned before, weren't really aware of accessibility as something that they needed to incorporate into either their systems or their processes. And it was something that we ended up negotiating into new contracts. So as we, got a new learning management system, and that's how we administer our training and exams. accessibility was a key piece of what we built into the contract with them. So we sat down with them to understand what they actually offer and then built in additional requirements. We did the same with our association management software, because that's where all of our exam registration, conference registration is built out. And, that system is what we use as the customer facing piece. And that was something that they just hadn't ever done. And so what we had to agree to in that relationship was that they would take care of their base functionality. And that was built into the contract, that they had to build in accessibility on their base functionality for the product, which ultimately serves all of their customers. And then any of the custom configurations that we were doing with the vendor, that we would take on the responsibility for any accessibility needs for that. But I think, having those conversations and really understanding and many times educating, and I'm sure Sam can speak to this as well, we play a piece in educating other groups about what the needs are, what the needs of our organization might be, and then holding them accountable in that contract process.
Sam, do you want to add a little bit to that? Thank you.
Yeah, so what Tasha's sharing is really important, and service level agreements. We know that the process for legacy systems were not built with accessibility, digital accessibility in mind. So we know that exists. And so that's kind of a given. And that's where we all start when we're talking about digital accessibility. However, the digital accessibility guidelines that have been integrated into disability rights and laws around the world are 21 years old. And the ADA refresh in 2018 specifically harmonized WCAG standards as expectations for the levels of digital components, websites, applications, and tools and services. So if you want to talk about in the US, that's fine. The European mandate, the EU mandates, and Web Accessibility Directive have been in place for 10 years. And in Canada, they're borrowing from ADA and EN mandates and the Web Accessibility Directive for AODA in Toronto and Accessible Canada Act. So digital accessibility has been around for a long time, but what's happened in the last 2 years with COVID and quarantine and people working remotely is a big focus on digital accessibility because people aren't able to walk down their hall to their colleagues in the office or use other resources. So
Sam, can you talk a little bit also what, other than, changing colors and text, what is digital accessibility?
So digital accessibility, and I see that Tasha has posted in the WCAG guideline, WCAG, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, are issued from a membership organization. So many of us work in membership organizations and they create standards, and that's W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium. But what digital accessibility means to the layperson who's not a techie is that no matter what kind of assistive technology someone uses, they are able to engage with digital technology the same way somebody who does not use assistive tech. So short version is most digital technology, websites, platforms, and tools and services are designed for people that can use their eyes and their hands to click a mouse. And here. So what happens when we take into consideration people that use assistive technology, their screen reader, their text to speech, their text highlighters, their contrast tools, they can only do what the underlying code tells them. And a lot of that is not usable. A lot of it is not designed. If you don't use a mouse, you can't engage. A lot of tech is designed literally to click here, that you can't do anything by pressing the enter key on that button, function, picture, image. So the tech is not written to work with assistive technology, which then means many people who use technology, who don't have a flesh hand, eyes that function, or use of a mouse, or use other inputs. So blind people use computers all the time. People who don't have hands use computers. I'm not trying to be flippant, but there's a big consideration, and we have the conversation often. Well, how would they even take the exam? Well, just a different input mode. in a different tool. So digital technology needs to be coded or remediated and resolved to allow assistive tech. But a lot of that is keyboard navigation and keyboard strokes and keystrokes. And the segue and how this connects to a lot of what we do. Every browser security lockdown tool for online remote proctoring blocks the ability to use the keystroke combinations people would use with AT, because the security says, hey, those keystrokes might also open another window, another browser, go somewhere else. So all, and I'll say all, I'm sure there may be one or two, but I've not yet to in conversation with 38 different browser security lockdown tools. None of them work with assistive tech. The platforms may be accessible, but the process to get there doesn't allow people to have an equitable environment using their own technologies. So there's a challenge, and it has to do with the technology and how it's written. And that's where we have the challenge of how do we tackle that? But that's what digital accessibility. So, but we want to talk about images like sessions or evaluation tools that have images or audio or videos. There are also ways to create accessible content. So I'll use an example, and Pam, you've heard of Ms. Natasha too. There's a group of nurses that do an evaluation for a knowledge base, and they were concerned that if they wrote alternative text, so they have an image they present, image on the screen, and you're asked a scenario of questions, and the image on the screen, I don't remember what organ it was. It was an organ and it had a blue squiggle on it. They were concerned that if they wrote alternative text or a text equivalent for that image, that saying a liver with a blue squiggle on it would give away the content of the question. But the concept they were trying to test is, what's the importance of that blue squiggle? Not that a blue squiggle exists, but what does that blue squiggle mean? And why is that important in diagnostics or assessment? So we can write, and this is the challenge. A lot of times the concept is, if I write the details about the visual image, I give away the question or what it's testing towards. But what that really means is we need to write our items in a better format that doesn't presume that everybody has vision. And so in some dynamics, like, well, if they can't see, they can't be a good nurse practitioner. Well, that nurse practitioner may have lost their vision and have 30 years of experience and have great knowledge to be part of a team. So the equity part in that is not discriminating against a person for not having vision that works. So videos should have captions, and videos also have what's called audio description that describes anything that is visually relayed. And we joke about that when we introduce people to audio description with video by using a clip from Frozen from Disney, where the snowman falls across the lake and his nose bounces across the frozen lake, and the moose is like, oh, I want the carrot. But all of that's described visually, but an audio description, which then also would be described in captions so that somebody that's deafblind could also engage, isn't missing what's delivered visually. So the concept of creating accessible content is part of a responsibility that we can all, as test hosts or delivery agents or item writers or reviewers, that we can all do that does not compromise the content of an exam or a credential. It's making it equitable.
So that is related to one of the questions that has come in from the chat. Vicki, would you like to come off mute and talk about this, or would you like me to repeat what your question, or have you gotten some of your answers? Vicki G?
Hi. Yeah, I think Sam actually covered them already. So thank you so much, Sam. That was one of my questions was, right, how do we accommodate visually impaired candidates on tests that have either images, videos, hotspots, things like that? And that was one of the, you covered exactly everything that my group has talked about. If we write out exactly what's in the image, it will give it away. So I have some great information to share. So thank you very much.
So when we think about it, I think our default is, or most people's default is, I'm going to look at the picture, and if I know what's happening, the picture, I can talk to you about it or explain why it's an issue. But what we shouldn't be testing for, well, you can, and this is a challenge, is that if you're testing for, can someone see the blue squiggle? That's different than what does the blue squiggle mean?
Right.
So when we work in teams of people, just like I go to medical terms because that's who I work with the most on these kinds of discussions, is nurses who use wheelchairs just can't transfer a patient in the bed, but they can still move around. But there are a lot of people in professions, we work in teams. So not everybody is going to have good vision and good hearing without, without some kind of supplemental tools and resources. But we shouldn't build our assessment tools to discriminate against those things. So whether or not somebody can perform and do those duties is a different thing than knowledge testing. So when we're talking about knowledge assessments, we shouldn't integrate discriminatory practices. And it's not intentional, it's just bias that's inherent in the human nature that we default to say, everyone should be able to do this. This is what a normal person does. And then we get into that. If we start to be aware of that bias, we can start to be more proactive in creating more accessible content.
Great, thanks
I
so
think
much.
that's where the partnerships come in too, where you can have, it's not just digital testing of accessibility, but it's actual live person testing of accessibility, whether it's your exams or your training. Sometimes we don't have those resources within our organizations, but those third-party external groups do have that, and they can do that testing, which is an important piece of building in that accessibility.
We like to encourage to make sure that disabled people are included in that, in the concept, in the strategy, and in the testing and evaluation. And if you don't have disabled people in your team, there are resources to find where you can have testers and reviewers and usability testing, or just hiring somebody that's familiar with accessibility to offer you insights and considerations.
Guillermo, you have your hand raised.
Yes. Thank you, Sam, for the plug-in for line up there. But I wanted to thank both of you. This is a fascinating talk you're giving, and I really appreciate it. I had a question. What came to mind, Sam, you've been talking a little bit about how the test sometimes is maybe inadvertently discriminating. And the word that comes to mind is like this KSA, right? So we usually talk about knowledge, skills, and abilities. And I think that probably abilities is a little bit of where the intersection of these two things is landing. So are you in a way advocating that we should be testing for knowledges and skills and not so much for abilities, or how do you take that intersection there?
So Guillermo, this is Sam. I'm not advocating against testing for abilities, but I'm considering what's the reality of the environment the person's going to go into. The context matters a lot, but if we are testing for abilities, it would be wise not to impose barriers about abilities that inherently or intentionally or not prevent someone from succeeding, because we have built-in human bias to consider what the minimally qualified candidate is. Here's the persona.
Yeah.
Do any of those personas, or before someone gets to participate in a certification process, is it clear to them that they would not have the capacity to do well in this because of the structure and the dynamics? And is there a way for them? Is there any alternate? We do a lot of engagement with neurodiverse people who standardized tests are, they would like to see them relegated to the trash heap of history, because a lot of people can't perform well. They are brilliant and can share that knowledge and can express it and provide it in context, but it's hard to do that at scale without having one-on-one assessment. So, I think abilities are important, and especially for performance regulated and licensed industries, those are important. But I think that we can carefully review how we create that content and assessment tools to not unnecessarily incorporate bias.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And the words you use, I'm thinking that many times I talk to clients or people working on tests that the people with a lot of experience that are usually the most engaged volunteers and SMEs forget the knowledge and abilities that they had when they were at the beginning of their careers. So sometimes they're, inadvertently bringing experiences and knowledges that they have now, and they actually somehow make it as, oh yeah, they need to know this. They need to be able to do this. So imagine that when all of the SMEs are able people. Right? I guess it's very hard to imagine, put yourself in the shoes of someone that doesn't have that level of abilities, but they still can perform. And I always joke about myself because I'm colorblind, and like I think more than 10% of men.
12% of all men are red-green colorblind. Yes.
Yeah, and I wasted 4 years of my youth studying chemical engineering, and I'm telling you, when I was at the lab, I could not see anything that I was doing. Everything was based on color as a cue, and I just couldn't do it. So how can someone writing an exam for things like that, and when there's no colorblind in the room, be able to notice that, right? So yeah, all great points.
So Guillermo, to that point, one of the components in digital accessibility, which applies in paper world too, color alone should never be your only mode of expressing information.
Oh yeah, I know. I completely ignore color. I ignore it. I never
because
use
it
as a guide.
it doesn't give you anything other than perhaps shades of gray or shades of green, or however your eye cones and rods are processing. But bar charts, graphs, images, study, pieces of books and information, we default to saying, hey, well, look at that blue one over there and you can see. No.
Yeah.
So we have to consider that when some of these elements of WCAG, digital accessibility, those components apply for books and written and engagement and teaching in universal design for learning. So not using color alone. First, don't use color alone, or use a label. But if that means you can't use a label because that would give it away, then the wiggly thing that is filled in with bars versus the wiggly thing that's filled in with dots. So patterns and textures are a way to relay that information. And if we remove color as the only context and we use textures and patterns, you can then write alt text that includes textures and patterns that also do not give away what you're trying to teach to.
Fascinating. Thank you.
So can we take a moment? We have another question from a little while ago. Stephen Garner, if you're still on, you brought up an interesting topic about sign language translator. Would you like to come off mute and ask a little bit more about your question, or start with that dialogue? You're welcome to, or I'm happy to repeat it.
Well, sure. The situation we ran into was our first time having someone that was hearing impaired was looking for a translator to work with them through the written exam and the performance exam. And neither the candidate nor our organization were successful in finding a translator that was qualified in ASL and willing to go through the 4-hour exam cycle. And our organization was a bit uncomfortable because we weren't skilled enough in any of our proctors and examiners to be able to identify whether appropriate or inappropriate communications were taking place between the translator and the candidate. So we were a bit stuck, and the candidate has now chosen to postpone pursuing the certification, but we as an organization need to find a way to step up.
Tasha, do you have groups of people you work with? I can speak to how what happens with a lot of our deaf community and technical programs and content. Tasha, do you have teams, and how do you?
Go ahead, Sam. Yeah, go ahead and I can chime in.
Sure. So in the US, there are registries for interpreters for the deaf, is an organization, RID, where you can search for interpreters. So I don't know many interpreters that wouldn't be willing to sit for full paid time to sit and only interpret maybe a few signs or a few bits and bobs here and there, because it's pretty decent money. So we regularly hire interpreters to sit with us, whether that's in person or remote, even for our examinations and our candidates. And RID, and there are other groups as well. So I have references for interpreters that are, BIPOC interpreters, and also people that work in technical fields. The biggest challenge really for your interpreters is finding somebody that is familiar with the terminology, words, and concepts. So just as if you were hiring an interpreter for an event or a conference, the interpreter should ask you, well, they should ask a few questions. They should ask, is your candidate who's deaf or hard of hearing, were they born deaf, or did they lose their hearing later in life, so that they know how they might engage? But also the context and terms we provide. If we have interpreters for webinars, we provide kind of a glossary of terms and the content in advance. When I hire interpreters for my exams, I provide them with the body of knowledge so that they can review the terms and tell me whether or not they're comfortable before we sign the contract with them in signing these terms. And so that's going to happen for interpreters no matter where you are, no matter what you're working on. And they don't need to exam questions, but usually your body of knowledge, your content outline, those kinds of, that high level should give an interpreter the ability to answer yes or no, that they have the capacity to sign and interpret. But interpreters are only, and this is why it's usually best to hire an interpreter versus the candidate bringing someone to remove bias, is that candidates, actual interpreters that are registered, skilled, and certified abide by code of ethics. They will only interpret what is asked of the candidate and only voice what the candidate asks. And they can be given clear guidance that they would ask the proctor and not provide any other information. So the interpreter is literally just interpreting in sign language what is either a question for the candidate that they would then sign, the candidate would sign to them, and the interpreter would voice to the proctor. And the interpreter should never engage in anything other than that direct translation of spoken, written, or audio words to sign language. Tasha, you got, is that?
Yeah, and I would just echo on the context. We're an acronym-heavy industry, and providing that context for both interpreters and even closed captioning providers is really key to ensure that what's coming across is actually what's intended, and that they have that background of knowledge before they get started.
But there are interpreters, so accessibility, digital tech stuff is really a specialty, but there are interpreter services that specialize in medical and science and tech and engineering. So interpreters will also, just like anybody else, would specialize in fields. So it may take some time, but I would encourage you, and I'll help you find connections, to find interpreter services that specialize or can support your field, so that becomes part of your toolkit, so that you have on hand and know that you can rely on at least a resource to go to find a qualified interpreter that can help.
That would really help. I appreciate it. Because
building those partnerships is key.
Yeah, we searched out the local ones here in Sacramento area, and were unsuccessful in finding someone either qualified or willing to participate in such a function.
I regularly, we don't have any audio in our exams, but I hire interpreters frequently. And so I will have my interpreter in one window and the candidate and me and the screen share and the webcam, and the interpreter basically sits on call for 2 or 3 of those hours. And then when there's engagement, they will interpret any of the engagement for the interview.
And all of our activity is live. It's in person sitting in a room doing a written exam, or standing in front of a set of plumbing assemblies, and the candidate is interacting with those assemblies, and the examiner is observing their performance to determine whether they're following the proper procedures or not. So there's limited technical expertise required.
But you need a person that's willing to come for 4 hours.
For 4 hours, and that we have some confidence that only interpretation is occurring and not assistance.
And that is an ask of people. Certified and qualified interpreters will abide by that code of ethics. Most of them come from court reporting as a skill. You'll find court reporting for both captions and interpreters will come under, you want somebody that's qualified, that works in this and agrees to that service level agreement and has that code of ethics. So that is the human interaction of trust, but that's where also working with qualified and professional interpreters will narrow that field down to where that should not be a concern for you.
Super.
There's a question that came in a little while ago as well, sent directly to me. Maybe that was on accident or not, but Sam and Tasha, we have talked a little bit about international influence and things like that, but how does this question that came in, how does accessibility become more difficult in a global market? Can you see issues in other locales outside the US? We touched on this a little bit, but many of our exams and programs they're international. So can we talk a little bit about that and how to accommodate and work with those local jurisdictions?
Tasha, does your group work outside the US and Canada?
We do not. So we're specific to the US and Canada. So I'll let you take that one.
So this is where international standards come into play. WCAG, WCAG, those Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, are the digital accessibility guidelines around the world. So digital accessibility standards, while the level of quality may vary in local jurisdictions, the EU has a larger requirement for vendors to prove they're accessible. And if not, it gets taken to the Ombudsman in the EU, in the European Commission. The Web Accessibility Directive in Europe applies to WCAG and how that's incorporated in Japan, in India. So there are 160 countries around the world that have signed United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities that talks about digital accessibility to WCAG standards. So digital accessibility, if it's done to the correct standards to WCAG, and there's versions, so 2.0 AA, which is there's A, AA, and AAA. AAA is the highest, A is the lowest. If products and services meet WCAG 2.0 AA is the standard that's usually incorporated around the world. International, the only challenge you should have is your language translation. The digital accessibility standard doesn't vary for what's accepted and expected in regulations around the world. Some countries don't have any regulation and some people don't have any guidance, but the international standard is the same.
Thank you.
Does that help, Cheryl? What you will find is if you're trying to do business in Europe, and I know some of our test partner delivery agents have encountered this, is in Europe, you have to prove that your product and service is accessible, and you have to provide proof and documentation to be able to do business in the EU. And that's going to become more hardcore in 2022 and in 2025 when the new Web Accessibility Directive comes in, because countries and governments will disallow you from participating in their markets. So today's a great day to get started on your accessibility journey. So
yeah, we've been doing Asia for quite a while, Korean, Chinese, and Japanese. We just extended into some of the Latin American and the EU markets. So yeah, that's why I was asking the question, is just because I know we've had some issues even just with accessibility. We finally have two people that's their concentration. One of their concentrations is accessibility. Yes, exactly. And Michael actually has been helping us along the way too. Michael Snellenberg, who I see is in here as well. So
hi, Michael.
Yeah. Yay. So yeah, so we're working on it.
So it is. So in a lot of countries, digital accessibility and rights of disabled people are suggestions and invitations without clear legal repercussions. So like Tasha mentioned, the ADA doesn't specifically. This administration is going to change that. We will see the court cases and court case law in the US is determining what's expected. And we expect the FCC and the DOJ to express a written specific in the US. So I think that will be coming in the next few years. But in a lot of countries, it's voluntary, but the digital standard that government agencies and companies will expect is that WCAG 2.0, AA, or higher.
That was great. Thank you. Looks like we've got a Maria, and please I apologize if I pronounce that incorrectly. Did you have a question you wanted to come off mute for?
No, I'm sorry. I was just listening.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, we've covered quite a bit in the chat. Is there anyone else who'd like to come off mute or add something to the chat that we can discuss a little bit further? Or
Pam, can I come back to something we talked about earlier that we didn't really dive into? So a lot of the processes, we've seen some really great improvements from our test delivery partners, from these, these agencies that take on the proctoring and delivery test centers and remote. And several are making great strides forward on making their platforms accessible. But we have to consider the accessibility of the entire process. So the discovery, how do I go to your test delivery partner page and sign up and create an account? Is that page accessible? Are those form fields accessible? Can I use my AT to create an account? Then how do I discover your exams? These interstitial pages, often interstitial being the intermediate pages between steps that go from system database this to next pages. Those interstitial pages often are not accessible. The accommodation request forms are often in PDFs that are not accessible. So when we create barriers to get to the test platform, even if the test platform is accessible, if all those process steps in place are not accessible, we really aren't delivering an accessible and an equitable environment for the candidate to start to engage with our process. So that's a lot of pages, and we walk through this on a pretty regular basis. My test delivery partner, we had their service level agreement change when they're doing a user experience redesign to include accessibility and usability in that UX redesign. So, so that's the process, and then the time frame that we ask for people. I know that when we're talking about test centers, securing private rooms and securing interpreters is a time-intensive thing, but we also need to be we need to be aware of the time frame we're asking for people, because if they are required to go and get a doctor's note on stationery to prove that they're disabled enough to qualify for an accommodation, that's time intensive and it may take weeks. So we need to make sure that that's readily available information, so that when people are planning for exams and certifications, they know how to backtrack several months before they start to apply to make sure they have everything in order. But we need to, the challenge is all these forms. So what's on an accommodations form? Can accommodations include unlimited? I'm trying to see what that question is. But so I had a discussion with one of our big test partners, one of the big games in town. They're like, but we're accessible. It's like, great, I'm on this webpage. I can't use my keyboard to navigate, and the fields have no labels on them. So if I don't have vision and a mouse, I don't know what you're asking for me on this form. Okay, so I can type that stuff in. I got somebody with vision to help me. I've typed in my name. I've gone this. Now I come to the page to make my accommodation request. Well, the accommodation request is on a PDF that's flat with no tags and no information. So all that displays to me on my AT, if I don't have vision, is image, image, image. So I can't engage with the request form. So there are some usability process, like things that we can all test kind of on our own without being techie codey types, to see, can the minimally qualified person using AT do these things? So
Carol asks a great question. What is on an accommodations request form for those that haven't had this yet?
Each organization sets their own accommodations request forms. So, but that does include being aware enough about the disabled community and what the common request might be. So you will find most, and the ADA has a list of things that are the standard kinds of requests that most people ask for. You're going to most often find, and this is where having disabled people help advise your certification committees and your boards is really helpful, or engaging with accessibility consultants that can provide that information. So you're most often going to find, I'm blind, I use a screen reader. I'm deaf, I need an interpreter. I'm deaf, I need captions. I am neurodiverse, I have a cognitive disability, an intellectual disability, a reading disability, a learning disability, I need additional time. I will bring a service animal with me. I have a hearing tool or product and tool. Do you have an audio loop? Some buildings have audio loops that will deliver anything that's expressed in video directly to the hearing piece. So additional time, Braille, screen readers, large text, captions, interpreters. These are the kinds of, and software. You may have accommodations requests for people that are digital natives who expect to be able to use their own technology. Is your platform accessible? Can I use my screen reader? Can I use Dragon? Can I use my text-to-speech tool? Can I use alternate inputs? Can I use eye gaze? Can I use a headline? So you're going to have questions about how disabled people engage with tech and what accommodations you are willing to offer and what accommodations you can provide and the time frame required for you to secure those accommodations.
Vicki, you have a question. Is the accommodations request from generally time limited? Can you explain that?
Yes, sure. I was just wondering if once the form is submitted, if it's only good generally for the next exam window, or if it, if someone's to repeat, have to retest on the, take the exam again, would they need to submit a new form?
Tasha, I think that belongs to each test host or credentialing team to determine. Most places.
Yeah, certainly, because sometimes it's a temporary accommodation that needs to be provided, and other times it's a permanent accommodation. So if you have, retesting requirements, and this is an individual who requires this accommodation permanently, we try to make that as easy as possible for those individuals. Whereas if it's a temporary accommodation for that particular window, then you accommodate for that and you ask the question again when they're, signing up for the recertification exam. And I would just, echo on what Sam was saying, asking the questions as part of the registration process. It's going to look different than the questions that an employer is going to be asking about accommodating in the workplace. So there's a lot of components that an employer is going to ask that you as the credentialing body don't necessarily need to get into in terms of, the level of detail, because it's a different experience. So I think building that into your registration process in an accessible way is a great way to be able to start the conversation, and then have your plan of action in terms of, what you're going to do to provide those accommodations when the requests come in.
And you may find people in the disability kind of community joke or be irreverent about this, but if somebody was born deaf, it's not likely that they need to go back to a doctor at the age 50 to get another note every 3 years to say they're deaf.
Right.
Yep.
So
Okay,
when you're
great,
writing your
thanks.
regulations and you're to consider what is temporary, situational, and permanent disability. Technology is great, but not many people who have detached retinas to have a bionic retina that allows them to see shapes and things. So requiring people to prove and get documentation every 3 to 5 years for permanent disabilities is a challenge that I don't think in the disability community thinks shouldn't be required. But policymakers that set things based on something that happened in 2003 when somebody tried to cheat a system to get additional time started us requiring disabled people to prove repeatedly that they're disabled. So there are some things that if you see there is a disability that it's not going to change. And so whether or not you require people to prove with written performance doctor's notes every 3 to 5 years, that's a policy consideration for each test host.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vicki.
Michael, I happen to know Michael. Michael, do you have any thoughts you want to share on from your perspective? We have somebody that's on the call that speaks to advocate a good bit for disability and engagement on exams. I think that's Michael, right? Yeah, I think I'm looking at the right name. Somebody I know. Maybe not. I can't see the whole list. But anyway, so the process question. So it'd be good things to make sure that your accommodations form is an accessible document, so that and if you can run Adobe Acrobat DC has an accessibility checker, which means you do have to have a paid version for that. If you're using a Word document, sometimes that's a challenge on filling in forms on Word, or if it's a form, make sure it's an accessible digital form. So those kind of considerations are barriers that have nothing to do with the test platform, all about the user experience and the customer journey.
So Samantha, I'm on now if you want to give me an opportunity. Sorry, it took a while to get my my unmute button.
So I know Michael through accessibility and digital accessibility, and Michael works in credentialing with his organization. Michael, and in technical field too. So Michael, might you speak for just a moment about how your team engages with accommodations for technical testing and digital exams?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things we do is we partner very closely with what we call 3P, or our third-party vendors, right? So it's very important for us to have that relationship. And there's a few of these partners that I'm referring to on this call today. But I think it's very important that we procure accessible as far as any kind of services, third-party services, and so on, that we acquire to help us deliver our training and certification solutions to our learners with disabilities as well. And so we're working closely with these partners and creating roadmaps alongside them to help us deliver a cohesive, accessible experience across the board. And so with that being said, it's very hard, right? Because we all want to be able to validate and verify that we deliver these accessible experience. But like everybody on this call has said, it's a very wide and deep topic as far as delivering certification solution goes. It's really looking at the different user journeys, and that's very important for me as a technical program manager, is to understand the different user journeys and to identify personas with disability particulars when we look at those user journeys, and how each of those user personas will kind of venture through their journey, and then what is it that we need to do to implement an accessible and delightful experience for all our learners with disabilities. So, and it includes starting obviously at the registration process, being able to find an exam and search the exams that's available, maybe for a path. So for example, I'm blind and I use your screen reading software, and I've had to do many certifications throughout my career as a software engineer. And it's critical for me to be able to go and discover, right, what's available. And then secondly, to also be able to use my screen reader to register for an exam. And then, of course, I typically ask for a extended time accommodation, especially in the field that I've been in that's very technical. It takes me much longer to process multiple choice questions, for example. I have to reread them many times and navigate back and forth with a screen reader to comprehend which of the choices I want to make. And then in many cases, some of the accessibility features that's built in these technical exams are flow diagrams and flow charts. And so, as we all have learned through our journeys, these diagrams and charts require alternative text for me to be able to explore what the diagram really is trying to communicate through alternative text. And so a lot of times those are complex diagrams again, and you have to repeat, read through different portions of that diagram to really comprehend what's been communicated to you, and then making a educated choice on what the answers are. So just a few examples of what we all take into consideration, and specifically, on testing items and certification items. I think as companies that want to really deliver on accessibility, I think we really need to rethink our strategy, where we've used this. I would call that a bolt-on process for accessibility, which is we remediate for accessibility. And what we do as our strategy to implement sustainable accessibility practice over, for the long term, is that we are choosing not to use remediation as our main accessibility process. What we are doing is we're shifting accessibility left in our product development lifecycle, and we introduce born accessible project solutions and programs. So what we do there is we incorporate accessibility guidelines that's focused on each of the roles involved in each of the steps in the product development lifecycle, and we develop accessibility practice for each of those roles, where those folks in those roles adopt that accessibility practices. And by the way, we measure it and so on and so forth with scorecards as well, to be able to report and give feedback on how well we're doing with the accessibility adoption and the adoption of accessibility practices in each of these roles. But what that does is we incorporate accessibility right from the start in each project, starting with our program managers, our project managers, our product development managers, and making sure that our project plans include scope for accessibility work to be done, budget, and all of the above. And then the process starts cycling through, engineering, making sure that our engineers have the accessibility practices. And a lot of these things are things like making sure our folks are trained, right? Each different role might need different training as to how they implement accessibility in their role. So, we'll do engineers, we'll do that for our quality assurance engineers, we'll do that for our UX designers. And so typically the sequence would be PMs first, UX designers second, then our flow, and so on. So you can see how the adoption of accessibility into our product development lifecycle is critical to be able to deliver certification solutions and sustain the accessibility within those solutions. So I'll just stop there. Thanks, Samantha.
Michael, thanks. I call on Michael simply because we know one another and have worked together in credentialing over some time, the last few years. So, but it's part of I think the value that Michael brings to his team, along with his technical skill set, is that first person lived experience of what the reality is of engaging with processes from discovery to registration and taking exams. So if you don't have somebody with disability with those skill sets on your team, it'd be a great user experience. And we're excited to see test delivery partners engaging and making things more accessible, but most of it is remediated. It's added on at the end, it's tacked on top, it's added to until somebody does a redesign, and those legacy systems are a big challenge for our test delivery partners. But you as a one-on-one don't have to be the technical expert. You just need to know how to do usability testing. You need to understand the consideration of the experience of disabled people as they engage with your content and your process, and give thoughtful time to how you build and deliver your process and your policies. To, as somebody mentioned in the chat, and we do, it's called the disability tax. It's really expensive to go and get an assessment. And that requires you to have transportation and safe dynamics to go to get an assessment from a therapist or a doctor to write up that you do indeed have a disability. But the other thing we have to consider is that in COVID and remote work, people's home environments may include dynamics that proctors think is going to compromise security. So consider that people may have televisions in their bedroom along with their computer screens, and it doesn't mean they have multiple monitors and they're trying to cheat the system. So consider that workspaces are different and that people may not have control over all of those dynamics, or if they're not requesting a physical accommodation because they can use their hands and a mouse and eyes, but they don't have the ability to disassemble their dual monitor stands on their desk or their television that's mounted on the wall. So it's not just disability, but also we need to consider the user experience. So not many people I know have the ability or desire to dismantle their TV mounted on their wall or their permanently affixed dual monitor stand with screwdrivers and hex bolts and 50-pound cantilever products and services. So some things that may not be accommodation request to take a test may also apply to the environment that people are in, working from home or in a work environment.
Yeah, and I'm seeing several questions in the chat, around the specific accommodation that was provided, and it not either complaints about it, or is that something we should offer. And I think some of the questions to ask is, what are we trying to solve? Like, what is the need, rather than going to the solution first? And that allows you guys to have the conversation with your organization about if somebody's requesting more time and they're requesting it over multiple days, what are we trying to accommodate with that? What is the need before you get to the solution? And I think the same thing, somebody mentioned, I think a chair and a mat that the individual didn't use. What was the need that was trying to solve? Was that something that you worked on collaboratively to address that? So that really did accommodate what they were actually needing? Or was it just, I need a chair and a mat, and that wasn't really what the accommodation needed to be?
Thank you.
I think Sam said keep the focus on the person and the versus the policy or the situation.
And
Absolutely.
be aware that you can change and update your policies and procedures as you learn through experience and as you become aware of changing dynamics of the human experience in your candidates in the world. So don't be afraid to revisit them and make considerations and update your handbooks and your policies.
Well, thank you. We are approaching the top of the hour, and we have had such a great conversation, a lot of really good dialogue in the chat and then also here. So I'd like to do a quick wrap up unless anybody had any final last questions they wanted to bring up before we wrap out this program. Awesome. So yeah, we didn't have a formal PowerPoint or a formal handout or anything, but we will be compiling everything. But, a couple of, just key takeaways, if you did want to write it down, if you're not already taking notes, is there's a lot of simple tasks that we can do now that won't infect the integrity or the security of your exam. We've talked about that for about 2 hours now, that this is, there's so many simple ways that you can address now. And our big focus has just been putting that human experience first. And, when making these decisions, why is there a time limit? Why are you asking this information? Can we just, what is this really necessary? We're not testing this information on the exam or in the training. Why are we doing that? And you need to make accessibility part of the entire process from start to finish. The first step they get engaged with your website to where your exam provider is through the full testing experience. And then finally, and Sam, I don't think you said this explicitly, and also Tasha, we need to not just find vendors that have this accessibility, marketed on their sales pieces and things like that. We really need to find vendors that have these as part of their operations, a part of their procedures, and also write them into, Tasha, to your point, write them into your contracts, because change from the vendors, as we know, comes from the clients, and we need to advocate for people that are in our environments, that are in our industries, and that's where we see real change. Because if we are demanding it and we are requesting it, then things start to happen. Tasha, you gave us a great example of that. So that's really all. That's just a quick summary. It's really hard to summarize everything we've talked about in the last 2 hours, but Sam, Tasha, any last closing statements before we close it out?
Tasha, one thing, there are a lot of companies using the word accessibility and offering what they call instant solutions for compliance. Just let me give you a warning about what that means, what it means to the user. So a lot of things just so you have a heads up, your marketing team, your communication team, your website teams, if somebody says that they can make you instantly accessible to comply with laws and regulations by installing one line of code, they are misleading you. That's the nice way of saying that. If they are saying, hey, we have these beautiful profiles that will make things perfect for a person, they pick one thing to apply. That also means that somebody that uses assistive technology is having their choices taken away from them. And a lot of the offerings on those instant fixes are things that every operating system and browser already does for free that's built in. If websites are built and digital accessibility is part of the mix, you can change the contrast, you can change the text size, the font, the display, and you can use built-in browsers and tools to do a lot of these things. So just be wary of people waving accessibility flags that claim instant compliance, instant solutions, or that you don't have to consider accessible content in your digital journey. Those are just some warnings. You will hear those called overlays or plugins. Not all of them are the same. Some of them do have human support where they scan automated and then have a human that will help you fix it. That's great. But anything that's all automated AI, that should be big warning flags, because if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
Yes, this is definitely a journey, and there's no quick fix for it. And I think, I've just found that doing the education, within your internal teams is really important as you try to build this with partners and build your system. So I think, having those resources that you can go to, and I just posted my email. We're still on our journey, but happy to continue the conversation with anybody in terms of the process.
Yeah, and there's a note in chat. There's nobody that, and W3C does not issue WCAG certification. Companies might issue a badge that says they've tested your system and that you meet compliance requirements. So don't let anybody also sell you that they are going to say you're W3C certified. That does not exist. WCAG certified does not exist. You may find companies, if they are your support company and they are working with you, engaged to say that we meet these requirements, but also be aware that ACRs or VPATs, that's when somebody does an audit on your site and writes a report and tells you what you did well with or what you need to change. Those are only valid for one moment in time. So they don't hold for years or weeks or even through one software deployment cycle. So just be aware, as people who may be trying to engage you on accessibility and digital accessibility, some of those things that may sound really flashy may just be really flashy. But again, that compliance is the base, the bare minimum. That's the low bar. Usability and actual accessibility and equity is what you want to shoot for.
Excellent. Well, Sam, Tasha, thank you so much for your time and support of this program. And thank you to our sponsors of CNG and also the program today. This has been absolutely wonderful. So I posted that link in there. I'll hang out for a few minutes, but I think it's safe to say that our program has concluded. So
thanks for making time to talk about accessibility. That's really exciting for us accessibility and disability rights geeks. So
we can tell you're both very
Absolutely.
passionate and committed. It's not just, it's not just a job. This is woven into your being. So we are very thankful. So have a great rest of your day, everyone. Sam, Tasha, thank you so much. And see you all next year.
sounds good.
Thank you.
Thank you,
I
guys.
did that. Bye, everyone.